Welcome to Chapter and Verse. This is Ray Dempsey, and I'd like to introduce you to my friend and classmate, Professor Raymond Sickinger from Providence College. He wrote an article which has received a lot of notice, and the article is entitled Hitler and the Occult, the Magical Thinking of Adolf Hitler. You know, the Adolf Hitler from World War II. But before we get into that, I'd like to talk about the Morning Mail, The Crucifixion of Jesus by Joseph Bergeron, a new book. It talks about what a medical doctor thinks. Joseph Bergeron is a medical doctor, and he examines the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. There's also another book which I've been wanting to talk about, but I hadn't until now, Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. It is the classic guide to understanding the opposite sex. So, without further ado, let's talk about Hitler and the occult, the magical thinking. You know, I was saying before our taping, our recording today, that I didn't think that Hitler was beyond the bounds of normal reasoning. I thought, you know, he had accomplished so much, and he was known to be a fiery speaker, working in thoughts and words and things. I didn't realize that he may have been at the mercy of magical thinking. But he may have been.
He may well have been, yes. He was an interesting figure, though he was opposed, Ray, to the idea that some of his compatriots had, people like Himmler and Hess, in terms of the occult. He himself had a superstitious side, a very real superstitious side, and most importantly, he had what some psychologists call the most important element of what's called magical thinking. Magical thinking has nothing to do with illusionists and the kinds of things we normally associate with magic. What magical thinking involves is the idea that somehow if I really will something, it will happen. And in fact, if it doesn't happen, it's because something has come in place to obstruct my will. So I need to persist in willing something. And definitely Hitler had that component throughout most of his life, and in fact, it intensified. In addition to that, he really believed that he was sent by God to do God's work.
Really?
He really thought that God had given him a mission. Part of what contributed to that was the fact that in World War I, he was a messenger runner. Now, the life expectancy of a messenger runner was pretty short on the Western Front in World War I, but Hitler survived.
Yes.
There were numerous times he survived events. For example, there was one time he was sitting with a group of people, and he just got this, he called it intuition, this message that he had to move. And he moved, and several seconds later, a bomb hit, killed everyone in that group other than Hitler. And so there were numerous instances like that that we would call perhaps coincidences or luck, but he saw them as God watching out for him, and most importantly, sending him on a mission. So he had this real sense of a divine mission as well. Interestingly, however, his divine mission ended up being quite contrary to what I think God, and particularly the Son of God, Jesus Christ, would in fact want.
What was Hitler's idea of God?
Well, there's no doubt in my mind after many years of study that Hitler himself did believe in a God.
Yeah.
But there is also no doubt in my mind, even though he was raised Catholic, and a number of, not all, but a number of Nazi officials were Catholic, even though he was raised Catholic, he did not believe eventually in the Christian God. There's no doubt of that in my mind. In fact, what he was moving towards more and more was an ancient Teutonic religion. That's what he was moving towards. And in fact, the only difference was that Hitler believed very strongly that Christianity would gradually die out, and he was going to allow it to die what he called a death over time. But followers of his, like Himmler and Rosenberg, they wanted to extirpate Christianity and Christians, especially the Catholic Church, as quickly as possible. So there was definitely within the Nazi Party a real antipathy to Christianity in general, Catholicism in particular, and there really was a movement to end the influence of Christianity and the Catholic Church, as well as the Protestant Church in Germany eventually.
I find this discussion to be important, Ray, because I think people, as the younger generation grows older, and may be looking for guide rails and guidance, I think we're losing an important object lesson for the masses once we lose sight of the historical event of the Third Reich. We're getting to the point where people don't know about it anymore. So we have an example, a practical example, where we can examine the nature of evil in a modern, westernized, very sophisticated culture, and how a modern Western culture could be turned into a death machine.
Yes. You know, it's so very, very interesting, Ray. We would like to think that the Nazis were monsters. Yes. And we oftentimes hear those things. And I always remember reading Fania Fenelon's diary. Fania Fenelon was a Jewish woman, a cabaret singer. She wasn't a practicing Jew, but she was Jewish. And she was in Paris, and all of a sudden she found herself rounded up and on a train to Auschwitz.
Wow.
And at Auschwitz, Fania Fenelon literally played for time by playing in the camp band because she was talented.
Right.
And it really caused tremendous problems for her because she was torn. You know, she would play for the Nazi commandants and she would play for those who were arriving, but it helped her survive. But at one point she was talking to the other women in the camp band, and they're saying, oh, these Nazis are monsters. And she says, no. She says, the problem is, they're human beings.
Yes.
And they're treating other human beings despicably. And she says, and that's the problem. We're learning something about human nature.
Yes.
And it's not good news.
Yes. At the Eichmann's trial, Hitler wanted to kill the Jews, but he didn't want to do it himself one by one.
That's right.
So he appointed one of his subordinates, a fellow by the name of Adolf Eichmann, to do the job. And Eichmann took the job very seriously, and he eventually fled Germany and avoided the Nuremberg trials, the United States Army War Crimes Tribunal. But he hid out in South America, where he was kidnapped by the government of Israel and brought to trial in Jerusalem for his work on what was then called the Final Solution. And there was a courtroom drama that took place. There was a man who was a witness to Eichmann's work, his deeds, and he fled the scene in great haste, and he may have even exclaimed something. A reporter followed him out and said, "Why are you having this response?" And he said, "Is it because you saw the monster in him?" And he said, no, it's quite different than that. He said, Eichmann was a man of manners and politeness. He was an example of kindness and manners. He said, I guess the point of what he was trying to say is that the demon wasn't a monstrosity. It was a genteel man who was capable of killing 12 million people.
It is. You know, Ray, it's amazing. One of the things that I've recently taught with my students is the Wannsee protocol. And the Wannsee Conference in January of 1942, Eichmann was there, Reinhard Heydrich was there, and head of one of the most important people in the Sicherheitsdienst of the SS. And there's these group of individuals, and over cocktails and food, they discuss for about an hour and a half how they are going to deal with the Jewish problem. And they come up finally with the final solution to the Jewish question, which is not only extermination, but extermination in a systematic way through using gas, eventually Cyclone B gas. And what is absolutely amazing about reading that document, and there's been a very fine film with Kenneth Branagh on it called Conspiracy, one of the most important things about that document is the business-like character of the whole thing, as if this is just another mathematical problem. And what I've learned is that there's something that happens where average people, common people, who in another life were what we might call decent people,
Gentlemen,
end up doing the most extreme atrocities. Just the other day, we were reading in the Western Civ seminar that I run, a wonderful book by a woman named Wendy Lauer. It's called Hitler's Furies. And what absolutely amazed me, it came out in 2013, what absolutely amazed me is that Wendy Lauer has completely changed how we think of women and their response. Because what she demonstrates is that secretaries, nurses, teachers, and also the wives of SS were oftentimes actively engaged in helping the Holocaust occur, or the final solution, whichever term you prefer to use. And we don't think of this as something a woman would do. So again, it's common, ordinary people in the kinds of positions we take for granted in society. So the human person is capable of incredible good, but the human person is also capable of incredible evil.
we're seeing some parallels in our lives today in the news. The other day, the Senate, the United States Senate, voted not to protect the lives of innocent children who were the product of a botched abortion. There are about 365 babies born every year from abortion. Now, if they're tended to, some of them are hurt very badly by the abortion. Some of them aren't. And if they're attended to, they tend to live. It's a major problem because the abortionist may be charged with a wrongful life suit, and he may have to pay the expenses of the child for 18 years. Mm-hmm. So there is an economic motivation to end the life of the child. And so there's a lot of abortionists who want to just quickly dispatch the child through whatever means is available. And we're seeing that sort of thing now. We saw it before Hitler took off. When Hitler was a corporal, recovering from a war wound in World War I, there was a book, or a pamphlet, better said, called The Release of the Destructiveness of Life Devoid of Meaning or Value by two people, Haka and Binding. Mm-hmm. And they said that there's a destructiveness in the lives of handicapped people. And we can release that destructiveness by killing them.
Yes. Well, it's interesting what you bring up, and these are obviously very important and also very difficult issues. But what I can tell you from the work that I've done in the period is that there developed really a culture of death in the Nazi world. And what you're referring to is extremely important. For example, the Nazis engaged in what was called the T4 program.
T4.
And the T4 program actually led eventually to the techniques that were going to be used in the Holocaust later on, the gassing. Because what they did is, during the war and leading up to the war period, those with significant disabilities, particularly mental disabilities, were considered to be useless eaters. That's how they were referred to. And therefore a drain on society, non-productive citizens. So what they began to systematically do is to go around with vans where there was carbon monoxide. They would put the people in the vans. The larger number of people, the better it was, because it was quicker and more effective. And then they would leave the vans running and they would die of carbon monoxide gas. This extraordinary disregard for human life in general.
Yes.
The fact that people are placed into categories. So, for example, there are inferior peoples.
Yes.
Slavic peoples and so forth. The Jewish people, they're actually at the lowest rung. They're actually considered to be an anti-race. One of the most ironic things is that though Jews were persecuted throughout history, throughout much of history, there was always an escape clause. If a Jew converted to Christianity, they probably wouldn't be persecuted anymore. But there was no escape clause in Nazi Germany because they weren't being persecuted because of their religious beliefs. They were being persecuted because they were considered to be this anti-race.
A genetic inferiority.
Genetic inferiority. And so you have all of these divisions where people are not created equal. It's just not within the Nazi doctrine and the Nazi thought. In addition to that, you have all of these conditions for German people as well. Never mind, Jews and Slavic peoples and so forth, because even within Nazi Germany, from 1933, July of 1933, there was a law against hereditable diseases, which meant that if you had one of those hereditable diseases, you had to be sterilized. So you could not have children. And it was not a long distance after that even those that had some of those diseases would be considered for termination as well. Or, for example, the doctors' experiments that occurred with Mengele in the camps and so forth, some of them particularly on twins, children who were twins, because from a doctor's standpoint, you'd have a wonderful, stable sample here to compare what you're doing. It's just, it's just an enormous, enormous degradation of human life, and it's a recognition of others as not being equal. And it goes so counter to Christian doctrine. It goes counter to most religious doctrine in that regard.
Hitler was interested in the work of Margaret Sanger.
Yes.
He sent an emissary to Margaret Sanger, an emissary whose name was Ernst Ruden. And she had ideas of eugenics and sterilization. And I don't really remember if she had an interest in abortion. I just don't remember.
Yeah, I don't recall whether she does, but I do know that a number of the ideas, those that certainly she would hold, led to two kinds of things. In terms of eugenics, those who study eugenics talk about positive and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics means you try to encourage the best to breed. And so in Nazi Germany, what they would do is they would actually identify young women with good and proper racial characteristics. They would identify young men the same way. They would encourage them to breed and then give the child over to the state to raise. That's called Lebensborn, the Lebensborn program. Again, no marriage. They obviously encouraged large families and so forth, but a lot of people don't know about that Lebensborn program, which was just a pure breeding program that went on. Now, on the other side, what some who write about it call negative eugenics, they also took steps to prevent breeding. And that is sterilization, forced sterilization of a number of people with different kinds of characteristics. So if, for example, there was a German person and they had maybe a club foot or something of that sort, they would probably be sterilized. Ironically, Joseph Goebbels had a club foot.
Isn't that interesting?
But never was placed under those restrictions.
Interesting. That's fascinating. I hear that there was an organization called the Children's Charitable Trust, which was an ambulance, or like an ambulance,
Yes.
and they would collect children with slight deformities, a misshapen ear,
Yes.
and they would euthanize the children.
Yes. Yes, I wish I could say that that wasn't true. In fact, there's one story in Wendy Laura's book where she says one teacher ended up being horrified because she had this young girl who had epilepsy in her class. And eventually found out that the principal turned that child over and the child was never seen again. And the teacher assumed that the child was taken away and euthanized.
This is before Hitler, isn't it?
No, this was actually during Hitler's reign.
Yeah.
Although there were currents in the air. You bring up a very good point by your question, and that is sadly, nothing that Hitler said or believed in or endorsed was new thinking.
Yeah.
What he did was take a number of currents that had been in the air, anti-Semitic thinking about eugenics and racial differences and so forth, and brings them together in what's a coherent and very sadly coherent system that is terribly destructive.
Yes. Yes. So there was a death machine, a death culture, and he just took the wheel.
That's exactly right. And he had a number of accomplices willing to do that at various levels. And then on the lower levels, what you begin to see is that though a number of people are reluctant to go along with this culture of death, over time, people get acclimated to things.
Oh, I'm afraid you're right.
And that's exactly what happens. You see it even with some of those. A man named Christopher Browning, wrote a book called Ordinary Men. It talks about this one police battalion that a number of the people in there were brought out with the Einsatzgruppen to go out and to shoot Jews, which was the first step before the final solution, which was the gassing and so forth. And he said that initially, a number of those men really were, upset. Some of them actually got sick doing this.
Wow.
But over time, they adjusted to it. And in fact, one of the biggest reasons they adjusted is because they felt they had a sense of duty to the state. And the second reason was they didn't want to let their comrades down. They didn't want to look like a coward. Oh. And so over time, ordinary people who initially were really upset about what they were doing began to adjust to the whole process. And so ordinary men became ordinary killers.
Which is concerning to me, because we have this culture of death in America today, in abortion and now infanticide. There is a great response to it, thank goodness. There's a lot of people now who were pro-choice a year ago who are pro-life now. We don't know what's going to happen in the next election, but we'll be watching.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the real danger is, and I think this is the real danger. The real danger is people don't reflect about things. We're so busy in our lives. And I mention this because these are some of the very things that people bring up in this period of time about the war that I've been speaking to you about. So, for example, Albert Speer, in his memoirs, he says, I really fault myself. He says, I don't want to be exonerated. I fault myself.
Yeah.
He says, what happened was, I did not take the time to reflect deeply on what I was doing or what the Nazi state was doing. He says, I was so caught up in the everyday work that I was doing that I didn't take time to think. And he said, and the Nazi state didn't encourage you to think.
Yes.
And so he said, I let things go by I should never have let go by as a person. And he says, and I'm not making an excuse. No. He says, I should have reflected more deeply.
There seems to be no accountability. The manufacturer of Cyclone B gas is IG Farben.
IG Farben Chemical Company, absolutely.
They're still in existence.
Oh, yes. In fact, there were really no serious repercussions. And in fact, a very interesting line of scholarship that's developed in the past 10 years or so in the whole field of the Nazi era is, in fact, the complicity of many businesses with the Nazi government. Many of the particular companies also made use of slave labor. Fritz Sauckel and others would take some of the people from concentration camps, some of the Jews that were healthier, and they would be slave labor. Eventually, they would be worked to death. But there was a whole slave labor thing that went on as well.
Somebody told me that IG Farben held the patent for Bayer aspirin.
It could very well. I'm not sure of that, but it could very well. It was a major chemical company. And IG Farben Chemical Company, Zyklon B gas, was gas intended to kill insects. That's what it was intended for.
Yes. Well, you've got a wonderful article here. You know, one of my dear friends is the late Dr. Joseph Stanton, assistant clinical professor of medicine at Tufts University. And he did an interview on chapter and verse. Many years ago, he interviewed Dr. Leo Alexander, a psychiatrist and a Jew, who was an official observer from the United States to the United States Army War Crimes Tribunal, otherwise known as the Nuremberg trials, where a lot of the Nazis were put on trial. And Joseph asked Dr. Alexander, how did something like this happen? And Dr. Alexander said, it happened when we in society agreed that there is such a thing as a life not worthy to be continued.
I don't think he's wrong, Ray, because as I said before, that is really a fundamental premise of the Nazis. It's not just anti-democratic, which it is.
Yeah.
In other words, all people aren't created equal. It goes even beyond the democratic side. What they really mean is that all people are not created equal, and they go a step further, because there have been other governments that say all people aren't created equal, but they don't necessarily kill people.
Yeah.
But they said all people are not created equal, and some are not worthy of living. Well, and that's the real danger.
Hitler seemed to believe in Darwinism. When Darwinism first, evolutionary Darwinism first took root, there was a social Darwinism attached to it. It was a racist polemic.
Yeah.
And Hitler seemed to believe that.
Oh, absolutely. In the 19th century, Darwin's ideas were taken by several people. The most important one was Herbert Spencer, started with Herbert Spencer. And Spencer developed what's called social Darwinism that you remarked on a moment ago. And social Darwinism basically takes the ideas of Darwin that's meant to be...
Ray, we're running on it. We have a few seconds left. May we pick up on this very idea for next week's program?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I'd be happy to do it.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ray Dempsey, and this is Chapter and Verse. Thank you for joining us today. With us today, in part 2 of our presentations, is my friend and classmate Raymond L. Sickinger, professor of history at Providence College, and somewhat of an expert on Nazi Germany and the lessons that it gives to others who want to examine a portrait of evil. I mean, how does a modern, Western, industrialized civilization, known for its culture and in its medical work, I mean, the medical journals of Germany were considered the envy of the world. Mm-hmm. And yet, medicine was corrupted, culture was corrupted, 12 million people were put to their deaths in an untimely way. And we're wondering, are there lessons for us in 2019 which we're about to lose if we don't remember what happened in a modern Western industrialized nation of Germany?
You know, the last time we were talking, right at the very end, Ray, we were talking about, you raised the question of social Darwinism.
Yes.
And whether, Hitler was impacted. And I had mentioned that absolutely. And that whole social Darwinist framework started with Herbert Spencer, who applied Darwin's ideas to society. And then others took his idea and applied them, to the idea of racism and so forth, racial differences. And the distinction of different races, basically inferior races, superior, these all come out of a social Darwinist idea. And the idea of social Darwinism is that life is a struggle, and only the fittest survive in that struggle. And that is definitely something that Hitler picked up on. In fact, he felt so strongly that it was a struggle or a survival for the fittest that he felt that there was only a particular ideology that could overcome that. And that ideology began with race, the idea that there is a superior race, the Aryan race, and that race is not just blonde hair, blue eyes, strong physically, which many people automatically associate with the Aryan race, but they are mentally and morally superior as well. And then that race must be preserved, and that's the fundamental purpose of the Reich, the state. And then the state, in order to preserve the race, must expand and find room for it. What the Germans would call, or the Nazis would call, Lebensraum. They must expand, and that expansion is towards the east, into areas like Czechoslovakia, Poland, and definitely Russia, particularly the Ukraine. And as they expand east, they can enslave those inferior peoples. And that's how we'll win the struggle for survival. So it's a very, very social Darwinist concept that really infuses much of Hitler's thought. What's also interesting is that we will oftentimes hear of the Third Reich. And the Third Reich actually has as we talked about in my article last week, a magical connotation to it, because what it involves is millenarian thinking. The Nazis always talked of the Reich of 1,000 years.
Yes.
And there's a magical or mystical both side to that number 1,000. That's why there's been so many millenarian movements. And most millenarian movements think that this is a crucial time, a leader is going to come forth, there are enemies opposed to us, and we must act fast to deal with those enemies. And that's exactly the kind of millenarian thinking that was in Nazi Germany. Hitler portrayed himself as the savior, a savior actually sent in many ways by the divine to save the German people from their enemies, and time was wasting and he had to take tough decisions. And so you end up having a very destructive regime come in, because people after World War I were fearful of the times, very unsettled, and here was someone promising them some kind of security. But security comes at a price sometimes.
Oh, yes.
It's at a big price.
Yes, I heard of a speech that he gave. Apparently, he observed a woman in the market having difficulty paying for her groceries. And apparently she was going to take off her wedding ring and barter with a wedding ring to buy food, according to the account. And Hitler raised the roof about this, and he said, never should this happen in Germany, and never will it happen anymore if he has his way. So he laid out a carpet of security for people.
Yes. Well, you know, one of the things that I've learned from friends of mine in the political science field is that oftentimes people vote the way they feel about the economy, interestingly enough. All other issues aside, if they feel pretty good about how they're doing and what's in their pocketbook at the moment of voting, they'll vote that way. And I think that's what happened in Nazi Germany as well. The Nazis promised, and they definitely produced an economy that was going strong. In fact, you had almost zero unemployment. And so people felt very good. So good, in fact, that they overlooked, didn't think about some of the other things that were going on. People thought, for example, especially in the period of 33, the first year that Hitler was in power, they thought, well, yeah, I know he talks about the Jews and so forth, but he can't be really serious. Well, he was very deadly serious about the Jews. And from the moment he came into power, there were systematic steps towards the Jews and others that he considered inferior. So again, people can be sucked into a system because they feel a sense of security, because it doesn't impact them directly at the moment, and because, as we said, I think last week, they don't take time to really reflect on the implications of what's happening.
It was terrible, the way people followed the leader in Germany. There was a photograph of an entire wall of men, maybe soldiers, and they were giving the Nazi salute. And there was one person who didn't give the Nazi salute, and the hunt was on to find that one individual and get the story about what happened there. Mm-hmm. The whole rest of the wall of people were giving there was one person who didn't give the salute, and the hunt was on.
Well, you know, what you're talking about there, too, I think is very relevant to what we're speaking about. One of the things that Hitler and the Nazis did was they feared, but they admired the Catholic Church. And one of the things they admired about the Catholic Church was its rituals, because rituals are very important to a religious faith or a religious group. The rituals are what binds people together. And so they would take those rituals, but use them for their own purposes. So, for example, when they were at Nuremberg in 1934, Albert Speer did these huge lights on the side so that though they were outside on the Zeppelin field, when they came on the field and those lights went on at night, everyone said, I thought I was inside a cathedral. Well, it wasn't a religious ceremony, but you see, it evoked the same kind of spiritual experience for them. And then, every time Hitler spoke, he's up on a huge platform, so he's way above the crowd. Being above the crowd, he always seems like the person in the know, the savior, the person who's been sent. And so your fealty, your loyalty is to them. And we all know that when you're in large crowds, you tend to act differently than when you're in either a small group or by yourself.
Social psychology.
Exactly. And so if others are saluting and if others are going wild, you do. In fact, it's so very interesting. I think his name is George Moss, if I remember. I know the last name is Moss, a Jewish historian. He writes on the Nazi era. And he says, you know, as a young man, I went to a Hitler rally. And he said, halfway through that Hitler rally, without my knowing, I saw myself giving the salute and saying, Heil Hitler.
Wow.
And here was a young Jewish man.
Yeah.
That was the kind of power that Hitler's speech had and the rituals that he brought people together with. And so they recognized that power. They were really trying to build their own new religion. It wasn't a Christian religion, but it was a religion that they would be able to control. In fact, interestingly, in Nazi ideas about religion, they had the idea that Christ was not a Jew. Christ was an Aryan, and he had been driven out at one point and went to the Middle East, and so he was a Jew. And in fact, he had criticized the Pharisees and so forth because he recognized what a threat the Jews were. And so Christ was actually following an anti-Semitic policy. And therefore, if we are following Christ, we need to be anti-Semitic.
They were involved in the mythology of the Norse and the German mythology.
Absolutely, yeah, the Teutonic mythology.
Even the Lebensborn program, which you mentioned last week, was adorned with religious and Norse religion.
Religious elements. Sure, in fact, what happened is with SS men, most of the SS ended up buying into, or at least going along with, this kind of Nazi religious approach. They wouldn't baptize their children. There was an ancient Teutonic name-giving ceremony. And it had all the same kinds of trappings as a baptism without any of the Christian elements.
I'm happy that we're talking about this this week and last week, because I think we're on the verge of losing knowledge of an object lesson which is very helpful to us in our contemplation and in our planning for a better life and a better society. We'd like to find out what people did wrong and not repeat it. And I hope we don't repeat it.
No. You know, one of the things too, the church went through a very difficult time, but there was one decision looking back that I think the church itself would say it wished it had done differently. It was done for all the right intentions to try to protect the church, but that was the Concordat of 1933 with Adolf Hitler. It was intended to protect the church, but one of the concessions the church had to give at that time was that its members could not be actively speak out on politics or get engaged. Something? And there was, well-intentioned, but there was a major error because it removed for several years, crucial years, that voice. And it doesn't mean that there weren't individuals who spoke up. There were. But it gave the church's voice, it diminished it a bit in terms of a social justice position. And I think the church looks back on that and says, we regret that. And in fact, Pius XI tried very strongly to reverse that when they came out with the encyclical in 1937, Mit Planenda Certa, with burning concern, deep anxiety, that really pointed to all the elements in Nazi ideas and ideals, the racial ideals and so forth, that were really pagan and really anti-Christian.
Pius XII, apparently, from an early time in the church, before he became Pope, had a grassroots intelligence service.
Yes.
Because his priests would tell him things and the laity would tell him things. And it was said that he knew more about the German people than Hitler did, because Hitler didn't have as extensive a gathering of information from the grassroots of Germany. But there were people, and people seem to have lost their freedom of conscience, which you mentioned before. There were some people who there were trains filled with Holocaust detainees. They were on the trains and ready to go to the gas chambers.
Yes.
And they were calling out for help. They'd call out from the trains, And there was a group of Protestants, I think, who used to have a band, a musical band, to drown out the sounds of people who were calling out for help.
Yes, yes. You know, the sad thing is, even nurses in the Red Cross, German nurses in the Red Cross, would not respond to those trains. And what's also interesting is the insights some of the people, they interviewed, for example, some of the train drivers, the people who drove the engineers. And one engineer said, well, he said, yeah, I suspected, I knew what was going on. But he said, if I didn't do it, I'd lose my job. And what would happen to my family? And if I didn't do it, someone else would do it.
Yeah.
And so instead of taking a stand and recognizing that, well, whether I lose my job or not, at least I can live with myself in conscience, I think it's that kind of utilitarian thinking, that practical thinking, well, if I don't do it, someone else does it, that human nature falls into all too quickly. And that leads to people doing the kinds of things that they did.
There were some priests and some ministers who objected to the Nazi experiment. And they were put in prison along with the other inmates of the concentration camps.
Yeah.
Maximilian Kolbe.
Yeah, Maximilian Kolbe is a wonderful example. Yeah. Maximilian Kolbe not only stepped up to take the place of a prisoner that was going to be killed. What a lot of people don't realize, and what I think is the most heroic and the most significant act he did, in the chamber with the other people that were starving, there were several soldiers who later converted to Catholicism who said, we have done this before. This was not the first time prisoners were starved to death. Mm-hmm. They said, we've done this before, and usually by the fourth or fifth day, the howling, the cursing, the swearing that comes from below is incredible. And they said, nothing came from below except hymn singing and prayers. And so throughout the entire ordeal, Maximilian Kolbe was able to lead those people, starving to death, himself included, in a peaceful death. That is absolutely mind-boggling as far as I'm concerned.
He didn't starve fast enough. They wound up giving him an injection of poison.
He was one of the last to go, yeah, because he did not want to die before all the others died. Oh. Before all the others died. And there were a number of people who stood up for their faith, both Protestants and Catholics. For example, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for example, is a wonderful example. Also, besides that, Cardinal Faulhaber in Germany was an outspoken critic. Bishop Galen, von Galen, I believe his name was an outspoken critic of the T4 program, for example. So, I mean, there were voices, but oftentimes those voices, unfortunately, were drowned out by larger masses and larger forces.
I want to bring people's attention to the article that you wrote on the Third Reich, Hitler and the Occult, the magical thinking of Adolf Hitler. Explain magic like we did last week.
Yes. Well, magic, most people, when they think of magic, they think of David Copperfield and illusionists.
Yes.
That's a modern form of magic in terms of a definition of magic. But what magic means in a cultural or anthropological sense is that there is a time in history where people thought that they could really manipulate or control nature, other people, and the divine. And they could do that by either willing something or by following very precise patterns of behavior, either way. And that's called magic. That's what really magic is. And so with Adolf Hitler really believed that if he willed something, it could happen. He also believed that if he had this particular vision and he didn't deviate from it, that he would achieve his results. And so both of those things exhibit magical thinking.
He seemed very taken with the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche
Yes.
In fact, he gave copies of Thus Spoke Zarathustra.
Absolutely.
Was it Stalin, Hirohito, and Mussolini?
Yeah, absolutely. Very interesting about Nietzsche, because Nietzsche himself said that racism is a scabby on the human heart.
Interesting.
So that Nietzsche himself would have been absolutely opposed to racism, though he had other ideas that we all know. For example, the idea that God is dead. Now, again, Nietzsche didn't say, I'm saying God is dead. He's saying, I'm looking around, and it doesn't look like people believe in God anymore. That's really what Nietzsche was saying. And therefore, we've got to look other ways. Nietzsche had a concept of what's called the Übermensch, the overman.
Superman.
Which, it's usually interpreted Superman. And what it means is that the person can rise above the average person. Well, the Nazis, including Hitler, took these ideas and misused them. Interestingly, when Nietzsche died, he died of mental illness in 1900. His sister, Elizabeth Förster Nietzsche, was a rabid anti-Semite, so was her husband. She got control of his works, and she would only publish those things that supported Nazi ideas and ideals.
Oh.
And in fact, the Nazis took his term Übermensch and applied it to themselves. We are the Supermen. But they also coined another term, Untermensch, which means subhuman, below human, lower than human. Nietzsche never used that term. So it's really interesting that Nietzsche's ideas, even though I have some real problems with them, many of those ideas were misused by the Nazis. Even he himself would hate to see how those ideas were used. And in fact, it really wasn't until after World War II, in the 1950s, if I remember correctly, that Walter Kaufmann and others began to get a hold of all Nietzsche's texts, and we got a much better idea of what Nietzsche was actually saying and where his ideas were misused by the Nazis. But the Nazis tagged Friedrich Nietzsche as one of their own and used some of his thoughts, or better, misused some of his thoughts.
You mentioned a few things. Hitler, some writer thought that Hitler had a problem with the occult, and that he got involved in certain monstrous sexual perversion in order to obtain clairvoyant powers and mediumistic powers.
Right.
Has that been substantiated, or is that a controversial thought?
Yeah, that's a very controversial thought. What has happened, Ray, is there have over the years been what I call two different schools or approaches. One school of thinkers says that Hitler was actively involved in the occult and he tried to tap into occult power and so forth. The second school of thought, actually some of the more famous historians of Hitler say, no, he wasn't. What I've done is, in my research, is say, well, wait a minute. Let's take a look at this and see if somewhere in between falls the truth. And what I discovered was that, no, Hitler was not actively engaged in occult practices. However, many of his accomplices, Himmler, Hess, and others, were actively engaged in occult practices, and those have been demonstrated. Secondly, Hitler was very much a superstitious man and prone to this magical kind of thinking where he thinks he can will things to happen and they should happen. But he also relied on astrologers.
Oh.
And the Nazis had several astrologers that would cast horoscopes and things for them. Now, Hitler was always tentatively skeptical of those, and I suspect that he was skeptical because he didn't like anyone who had some kind of authority higher than he was. So he always saw these astrologers, yet at the same time he listened to some of those horoscopes as well.
He was concerned that they would tamper with his intuition.
Yes, exactly. Now, in the other area, there has been various research, some of it documented, some of it not, that Hitler had various sexual kinds of problems. None of that has been absolutely, what I would call convincingly demonstrated. However, we should know that Hitler really had difficulties in his relationships with women.
Yeah.
He had very stormy relationships. He was involved, for example, with his niece, Gayle Raubel, and
Yes.
she committed suicide because he was much too controlling and so forth. And then later on,
Was there a controversy about whether or not she really committed suicide?
there is some controversy around that. Again, it has never been completely proven or disproven, but there's definite, one thing that's definite, if she did commit suicide, it was because he, in a sense, drove her to it from his, you know, his excessive attention and his obsessiveness. The other thing that I think is important to note is that he did have Eva Braun.
Yes.
And he just put her in Obersalzberg and, you know, in the Alps. He would visit from time to time. He never married her, felt that he couldn't marry as Der Fuhrer because it would make him seem too human. And so he never married Eva Braun until they were in the bunker.
Yeah.
The Russians were descending. He married her. This was around the time of his birthday, April 20th. He married her. And shortly thereafter, they committed suicide, and their bodies they attempted to burn their bodies and so forth. And so he had a very, very odd kind of relationship with women, although a lot of German women were very much attracted to him, almost like a rock star.
Really?
Yeah.
The way he was portrayed as an Uberman,
Yeah.
the idea that Leni Riefenstahl did the movie called The Triumph of the Will.
Triumph of the Will, 1934. Yeah.
And she put the camera down low, and she put it up towards Hitler to make him seem like a massive force.
Yes.
And he just pounded away at the ideas that he was sharing with others.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And even the use of light at those rallies, the Nuremberg rallies, the use of light was powerful because much of the stadium would be in darkness, but where Hitler was all light. And that's a very powerful religious concept, light and darkness. I mean, that's what we have. We celebrate that at Easter, don't we, when the Easter candle comes in?
Yes.
Christ is our light, and it comes into a darkened church. So the idea of light versus darkness is a very powerful supernatural or spiritual image. They usurp that again from the Catholic Church, and they use it in this context so that Hitler is the divine savior.
We only have about a minute left. I wanted to close with the idea that my friend Joseph mentioned when he interviewed Dr. Leo Alexander.
Yes.
Leo Alexander was an official observer from the United States to the United States Army War Crimes Tribunal, otherwise known as the Nuremberg trials. And Joseph asked him about his experience with the Third Reich. And Joseph said to him, "How does this happen? How did the Third Reich kill 12 million people?" And Leo Alexander said to Joseph, "It happened when people accepted the idea that there were other people whose lives were not worthy of continuance."
Absolutely.
We're facing something like this now in the United States Senate, where the Senate and the House decided to allow infanticide following abortion procedures. And we don't have the courage of people to say that even born children have a right to life. Ray, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ray. It was a real pleasure being here. I
Pleasure
hope
to
I
have you.
helped.
You did. And we barely scratched the surface of your article.